Welcome, Professor William Pinar from the University of British Columbia. Dr. Pinar is a world-renowned scholar in curriculum studies, known for his reconceptualization of curriculum theory and the method of query. Thank you, Dr. Pinar, for joining us for this informal interview organized by JCACS. And this is Aide Chen, the host for this session and a PhD student in educational studies at Western University. And so our first question is about your previous published books. So based on what I know, you have published many books as an author or co-author over the past few decades. And some of the book titles include What is Curriculum Theory? Educational Experience as Lived, and also curriculum studies in many parts of the world, including but not limited to China, Brazil, and South Africa. Could you please share just one and specify its contribution to the field of curriculum and education?
What is curriculum theory? I define the topic as the effort to understand curriculum and indicate that it's informed by scholarship in the arts and humanities.
That was a very in-depth book indeed. And regarding your scholarly development, here comes the second question. Could you please name a book that has impacted your work as an emerging or established scholar in the field of curriculum education?
There have been many books that have influenced me. Really, it depends on the era in which I'm working. So, for example, as an undergraduate, I was very much influenced by Jean-Paul Sartre, especially his early phase, that is being nothingness, and also his novel Nausea. But my senior year, I became interested in media and technology through Marshall McLuhan. And then also for my teaching methods course, we have one text, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And so I became very interested and influenced by Freire as well. Different books followed. I did my practicum in an all-black junior high school, and I taught the African-American novelist Richard Wright, his autobiographical study, Black Boy, and also Eldridge Cleaver, his Soul on Ice. Cleaver was the Minister of Information for the Black Panther Party. After I took my PhD, I became interested in the work of Virginia Woolf, whom I'd been introduced to as a PhD student. I did much of my PhD coursework in an English department, and I'd been introduced to Woolf then. But she became, especially Mrs. Dalloway, but also a little bit later to the Lighthouse, influenced my thinking about the curriculum field and the effort to portray our experience of the curriculum, which then led me to this concept of query. So there are many other texts. One at that time I mentioned before we move on is Alvin Gouldner, his 1970 book, The Coming Crisis of Western Sociology. And in that he questions the scientism of especially US-based quantitative sociology. And he posits this concept of domain assumptions, pointing out that however strictly quantitative the sociologist is, he or she is enacting, without perhaps even being self-conscious, their own assumptions about the nature of society, about the nature of various populations I'd have, and in fact to rethink those and to call them into question. And that also then led me to focus on autobiography and the concept of query. But there have been influential texts all along. I could cite in preparation for our conversation, I had tried to make a list, and so there are 12 or 15 But those are indicative, especially in that early era. And the early era, of course, is so imprinting. I would say, even though I worked on race and queer theory and internationalization, in some fundamental way, those early texts have remained formative of the way that I think and the way that I work.
Sounds very interesting. There are many books that I would like to read. I also encountered those critical theorists publications such as Paulo Freire's Critical Pedagogy. I think they really had a huge influence on your work. So
yes, and on many.
Yeah.
On many.
Then let's move on to the third set of questions. How has your personal experience shaped your understanding of curriculum and education? Or how has your experience directed your work in curriculum and education?
Yeah. Well, I would say the most profound experience has been the experience of being a student, primarily at the undergraduate level, although my senior year I was in an honors course that was influential on government and where I was introduced to Marx. But as an undergraduate, I would say that the experience of academic study, including revisionist historians' studies of the US, it really influenced my entire orientation. And so, as you know, I've emphasized the concept of study as really more important than the concept of teaching. The other, I would say, has been so informative has been my brief period as a high school teacher of English. That secured my solidarity with the public school teachers. And that experience was also informed by being a student. After teaching that group of poor all-black 8th graders as my practicum, I took a job in an elite New York City suburb. 95% of the students went to university, 30% went to Ivy League.
That's impressive.
And so I was very eager to study them and use their own experience and knowledge and their own feelings to help them understand the various works of literature that we were studying. It was an extremely interesting place to work. The English department was organized around electives that were offered every 6 weeks. And we had a budget to buy paperbacks, and so we could constantly change the readings. And so I was able to teach 2 courses on existential literature, sort of drawing on my interest in Sartre, but also Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and others. In general, we were given a great deal of freedom, and so that experience of being taken seriously as an educator, that is, being able to choose what it is I taught, and also being able to choose how I taught. There was no template that was uniformly enforced, either in the English department or in the high school. So having that experience of grappling with students who were also smarter than I, with those all-black students, I think even there was a kind of submerged arrogance that somehow I could provide some kind of liberation experience for these students. And certainly teaching outside New York City on Long Island cured me of that. And so it was a very welcome humbling and a return to this sense of receptivity and openness and self-criticality that for me are really the features of being a student.
You mentioned you were teaching those marginalized group of students. And
right.
How did you teach specifically?
Well, it was, I had gone into that practicum with that methods course based on Freire's idea of small group work and conscientization. And so, so dialogue and conversation were really structuring ideas of how I thought about teaching. But these poor black kids were absolutely stupefied by me and by reading Cleaver and Richard Wright. You see, before their regular teacher had been focused strictly on grammar, and because she understood that their English was non-standard, and that from the point of view of getting a job, they would have to learn standard English. Soon after, there were controversies about this approach, and many studies of, quote, Black English, and acknowledging that the culture influences language. But my practicum occurred just before that. So she was teaching grammar. So here, all of a sudden, they were reading about racism, and Eldridge Cleaver has a kind of sexualized theory of Black racism, namely that white men are jealous of Black men's masculinity. And so that sexual desire laces all interracial interactions. Well, they were a bit shocked, and so they fell silent. So you see, I was in a kind of crisis initially. Here I was expecting dialogue and conversation, and them to be kind of erupting with their own experience, and they were simply silent and sullen. And so I ended up lecturing for 6 weeks. You would think I would get a very negative evaluation, but somehow I didn't, and I was even offered a job in that school. I don't understand why. But I understood that I was over my head, that I didn't know really what was going on. And so I thought I would try another teaching experience where it turns out I didn't know what was going on either. And I think that's part of my fundamental orientation of being a student. Being a student, as you know, is not only an intellectual challenge, but it's an emotional challenge. You can feel overwhelmed, not only by the amount of work, and by the expectations of the instructor, but by the material itself. Conceptually, sometimes it can be jarring and not readily understood. And so that experience of being challenged and sometimes feeling like I don't know what's going on, at any rate, that was in Columbus, Ohio, where I taught the marginalized students, as you put it. It was an all-Black school, so they weren't marginalized there. At any rate, in Port Washington, outside New York City, those kids, once they trusted me, which happened pretty fast, they talked all the time. So that kind of dialogic model of classroom teaching was readily available for me, and we worked constantly to listen to each other and ask questions of clarification, to avoid judgment, and to allow a person enough time, not just to answer a question that had an obvious answer, but to explore how that person thought about their domain assumptions, if you will, to recall the Goldner concept, and to think through what this particular assignment meant to them. And so that was an experience when I had a certain kind of dialogue that stayed with me when I did the internationalization work. Let me add that at the high school where I taught, I also took the one small class of non-college bound students. And these were students, I don't know how their parents afforded to live in this place. So there was a very small percentage in this rich suburb that had no money and felt totally alienated. Now with this group, it was a very different story. Oh, they talked, they swore at me, they refused to do my assignments. It was an ongoing confrontation because they were so angry about being discarded, by being nobody in the school, being the servants of the rich residents. And so that was an extremely interesting experience because it taught me that, dialogue isn't necessarily polite. when you're being sworn at and screamed at, screaming back is appropriate. It was the only way to get the attention. It's true I didn't scream beyond that. It wasn't a kind of self-indulgent expression of my own anger. I tried to keep that private, but it did teach me this great lesson that there's no uniform teaching practice model, even dialogue, that each of it is very situational, and that professional discretion and judgment are really key here. Because the educator has to make a series of ongoing decisions really every day with almost every student, if the class is small enough, how to proceed. So that teaching experience has never left me and has remained influential.
Mm-hmm. I agree that teaching is very situated. Here, I also want to add that for those of you who may be watching this interview, if you're interested in knowing more about Dr. Pinar's lived experiences, you may refer to his book, Educational Experience as Lived Knowledge, History, Authority. I highly encourage you to read it. So moving on, the fourth set of questions is about the impact of external or environmental issues and possibilities. Specifically, how do local and contextual issues and possibilities constrain or enable you to work as a scholar in curriculum and education? And how are these compared to issues in other locations?
Well, as you know, there's almost an infinity of differences in work settings. I've taught I've been very fortunate in my settings. My first position was in Western New York State at the University of Rochester. And when I went there, Rochester was the second wealthiest university in the United States behind Harvard. We had almost no bureaucracy. We did have a complete academic freedom in terms of our research and our teaching, but everything else was handled by administrators. We had one meeting a semester. It lasted an hour. And so we were completely on our own, which, as you can imagine, also causes great anxiety. Because it was made clear that you've got 6 years to do something interesting. That's what the associate dean said to me. And the University of Rochester tenure required a special committee for each person. And I learned later that I had 2 English professors, 2 historians, and 1 philosopher of political science on the tenure committee. And they wrote to me when I got the review, a 17-page typed, single-spaced, before computers. They read everything. It's still the best critique of my work I've ever received. My point is that I had, almost being an assistant professor at Rochester was a little like being a postdoctoral fellow, because I was surrounded by incredibly interesting, intelligent, and in terms of the arts and sciences, really celebrated professors like Christopher Lash, for example, whom I've quoted in my books a number of times. And Rochester was small enough. There were 3 campuses, the Eastman School of Music, and Rochester is most famous for the Eastman School of Music, but also a huge medical and dentistry campus. But I was on the liberal arts campus, and there were only 3,000 students. And we had a faculty club, and so there was a very much a collegial and very powerfully intellectual kind of ambience, and that influenced me very much. When I went to Louisiana, what was curious about Louisiana is that it has a very high proportion of Ivy League PhDs. And so even though it's a public university and always running short of funds, because Louisiana's economy is so up and down, reliant on tourism and oil and gas. It's suffering terribly after the pandemic. But at any rate, administration was quite light there. We had a meeting every month, but they were brief. Like Rochester, I had enormous time to read and to write and to think. Moving to Louisiana, forced me to think about race again. I'd been interested in race as an undergraduate, but now I was facing a state where structural racism was obviously endemic. And I was invited by the administration actually to try to rectify that in some small way. And I negotiated a relationship with one of the Black universities in New Orleans to encourage doctoral students study, especially of race. I was half-time education, half-time in women and gender studies. And I had become interested in queer theory, so I was able to offer courses in queer theory and think about LGBTQ issues. And so it was a great reluctance that I left, especially because LSU matched the offer that UBC made. What got me interested in internationalization was an experience in 1993. I was asked to represent the United States at a UNESCO World Conference on curriculum. And I had all kinds of responses, not to me. Maybe most of the people there didn't know my work. They only knew that I was the American. And so I just got clobbered by many people who resented the United States often for very good reasons. And so that jolted me into realizing that even though curriculum is a worldwide concern, it's probably handled rather differently elsewhere, even though the US tries to export its own conceptual products for sale worldwide. So UBC offered me an opportunity for funding, and the Canada Research Chair gave you a leg up for that. And of course, the student population at UBC is very worldwide. I've often felt when I taught seminars there that I was at the United Nations because there were representatives of each continent in the class. And I've been grateful to UBC for that opportunity. One sort of shock for me at UBC was that bureaucracy has a very different valence, I think in Canada generally, but certainly at UBC, it's considered quite important, and so-called faculty governance. And the faculty seem to want to govern all kinds of things that I would be happy to leave to the administrators. So there's a heavy load of bureaucracy. I've been able to resist it much of the time, but it's impossible to resist it all the time. So that's been the one sort of shock for me at UBC, but primarily a very positive experience. So at any rate, to answer your question, as you can see, context matters very, very much, and the conditions. You know, if you're teaching 3 or 5 courses, obviously your capacity to do research is limited, especially if you're teaching very large classes.
I can see that education is very heavily influenced by bureaucracy and socio-political factors. So let's now turn toward your own research in the future. What issues relating to curriculum and education would you like to explore more in the future?
Well, I'm involved in 2 big projects. One is that I finally have turned my attention to curriculum studies in Canada. And so I have a SSHRC-funded project with a website and an online seminar series. And there'll be a book at the end of that. And the other is I'm returning to one of my longtime interests, the post-World War II Italian filmmaker, poet, and novelist Pier Pasolini. And I'm working on a book on him that allows me to talk about the concepts of public pedagogy, queer theory. And then I'm interested in what I'm tentatively characterizing as a praxis of being present, which is nowadays mediated through Zoom and other forms of social media. Those 2 projects have been interrupted, though, the last couple of months because I'm co-author of the chapter on curriculum for the UNESCO assessment of education. That work is mostly done. That'll be out in 2022. And I just concluded a chapter for the Routledge yearbook on education for 2022. Interestingly, you mentioned in your introduction the reconceptualization, which I've always sort of located historically in the 1970s and also in the United States. But it's somehow attracted attention now, not historical attention. For example, at UBC, Sam Rocha has just published a book called The Syllabus as Curriculum, a Reconceptualist Approach. And next month, I'm going to begin work for an invited article for an Austrian journal that wants me to sort of summarize what the reconceptualization was, but then also then to suggest its significance for the contemporary field. So once I finish with that, then I can return to Pasolini and the Curriculum Studies in Canada project. So that should occupy me till retirement, I trust.
Sounds like there are many interesting projects at hand, and we look forward to your work in the years to come. So in the face of the crisis of the COVID-19, what do you think might be the new direction of research on curriculum and education? And what educational change might we see in light of our experience with COVID-19?
Yeah, as you might predict, I think there'll be an accelerated momentum of interest in technology and education. As you know, the pandemic has forced everyone online, which has been a catastrophe for hundreds of millions. If you know the United Nations report, the estimate is around 200 million children have no access to the internet or to devices, and so they have no access to schooling. Moreover, maybe as many as 10 million of those children have been forced into child labor, including sex trafficking. So the pandemic has been a catastrophe for 200 million children in affluent countries, at least in the West, and certainly in the United States. There's been considerable debate about online learning. And the overwhelming consensus among parents is that it's simply a catastrophe for young children, that it simply is ineffective, that it's dysfunctional, and that certainly elementary school students, maybe K through 8, the secondary school, and of course university is another issue. The issue that's close to my heart is the reorganization, especially of the secondary curriculum, but I think the elementary would follow, away from the traditional school subjects, which for me illustrate a kind of academic vocationalism, moving from simple to complex as if one were going to become a mathematician, so Algebra 1, Algebra 2, which are very much, of course, influenced by university admission requirements and by university professors who want students to know something about algebra when they take the course at the university. I'd like to see a move away from that organization to more topical organization. For example, in March, I don't see why we couldn't offer secondary schools and elementary couldn't offer courses on the pandemic, both from physiological, medical, but social and economic. I mean, there are a whole series of kind of school subjects that could be informing of more topical subjects. And for me, the key there is that the academic curriculum should be seen as enabling students to understand what's happening to them in their lived experience. It should give them concepts and interpretations. They shouldn't accept them blindly, of course, but it gives them language to think about what's going on in the world. And if we were much more nimble and topical in our curriculum organization, we could be responsive. Now, I don't want to be just faddish and respond to whatever is happening, but nonetheless, there could be more responsiveness to the local situation and to global and as well as national developments. Finally, as I discovered working on this UNESCO project, there's a big push, especially in UNESCO, on neuroscience. So the curriculum question gets sidelined. They're not so interested in that. They're happy enough with academic vocationalism. They just want to figure out a way to get kids to learn it. And so there's the pharmaceutical wing. Pharmaceuticals are always already being widely used in the United States for HDD, but also for other psychological resistances to learning. And so there's very much an interest in using neurological science to, I would say, manipulate students. They see as facilitation of student learning. For maybe the most frightening instance of this, and maybe you know it, is this partnership between Pearson, the educational publisher, and IBM, and IBM's computer, Watson. Those two companies have a project in which they're working on a chip. Do you know this? They want to put it underneath children's skin so they can get real-time data about the cognitive and affective issues students are facing when they're working on, say, an algebra problem. Now, how the teacher is supposed to access that real-time data, I don't know. It'll be computerized itself. And then some kind of recommendation or intervention will be recommended by the bot. But for me, this is a nightmare.
Is it
one thing propagandized? Exactly. But that question isn't asked. That's, for me, you've asked the question. Is it ethical? The question is, will it work? Will it work? Can we raise student test scores by getting a chip under their skin and knowing what's going on inside of them? So at any rate, that I'm afraid is the future of education.
Your statement reminded me of the curriculum implemented in Finland. I think they are doing some kind of topic-based or phenomenon-based curriculum. Yes. What do you think of that?
Yes, there's much to admire in Finnish models and practices of education. And there's worldwide acknowledgement that it's admirable. But it seems to stop there. Other countries don't seem to be interested in finding their own adaptations of the Finnish model. Certainly not in Asia, certainly not in the US, maybe to some extent in Canada, at least in British Columbia. The new ministry guidelines are fairly open. At least that's what teachers report. But it seems to be like the ornament that I was at LSU. It seems to be put on a shelf to be admired, but not to be used.
These are some thought-provoking questions for more scholars to investigate.
Yeah. There are many thought-provoking questions. Yes, that's right. Appreciate your interest and appreciate your questions.
My pleasure. That's basically all the questions in this interview. Is there anything else you would like to share?
Not really. Just wish you well in your studies and stay safe.
Thank you. You too. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.